Nathaniel Ross had lived most of his life in houses he designed for other people, but the mansion he now occupied had never been his own creation. It had been the work of a celebrated architect from another era, commissioned by Nathaniel's late wife, Eleanor, at a time when she believed permanents could be bought with marble staircases and hand-carved balustrades. When she died unexpectedly 5 years earlier, Nathaniel could not bring himself to alter even the smallest detail of the place. He left her writing desk by the bay window, still stacked with the envelopes she had once scrawled notes upon. He kept her porcelain figurines arranged in exact rows across the glass cabinet, resisting every impulse to dust too thoroughly for fear of erasing the faint impression of her fingertips. The mansion, for him, was no longer a stage for dinners and soirees as it had been in her lifetime, but a mausoleum of memory, an architectural reliquary that both anchored and haunted him. His neighbors regarded him with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Some called him eccentric, a reclusive widower who rarely attended neighborhood events, while others envied the sheer scale of the property, perched on the hill like a guardian over the cul-de-sac. Nathaniel was aware of their glances and their whispers, but he preferred silence to the hollow niceties of suburban gatherings. His days passed in quiet rituals, walking the garden paths at dawn, tracing his wife's initials carved into the old oak at the back of the property, sketching designs in his leather notebook, though he no longer accepted commissions. The Homeowners Association had long been a thorn in his side, not because they demanded much of him, truthfully they were almost deferential, but because he disliked the principle of collective governance over private land. Still, he tolerated them, signing forms when necessary, ignoring letters when possible, and paying dues without argument. The mansion was large enough, its iron gates imposing enough, that he felt insulated from their constant attempts to regulate paint colors and mailbox styles. For years they had left him alone, perhaps believing that his wealth and his aloofness placed him beyond their reach. That illusion began to shift one spring afternoon, when Veronica Clay, the HOA president, appeared at his front door with 2 board members in tow. She was a tall woman with a fixed smile, the kind of expression trained by years of committee meetings and small-town politics, and she carried a folder tucked under her arm as though it were a ceremonial object. She spoke with an almost rehearsed cordiality, explaining that the HOA's office space was undergoing structural maintenance and that they were seeking a temporary location for board meetings. Nathaniel was initially prepared to dismiss her request outright, but when she suggested that a portion of his grand hall, unused, she pointed out, since his wife's passing, would be a suitable venue, something in his resistance softened. He was not naive. He knew her tone was laced with calculation. Yet he also felt an odd stirring, a desire not to be the perpetual outsider in a neighborhood that had always regarded him as aloof. Against his own instincts, he told her she could use the hall for meetings so long as the arrangement was temporary and confined to that single space. She clasped his hand in gratitude, her smile widening, while the board members glanced at each other with a satisfaction that unsettled him. In the days that followed, Nathaniel tried to ignore the faint unease gnawing at him. The board came once a week, entering through the side entrance he had designated, carrying folders and speaking in hushed, officious tones. He would retreat to the upper floors, listening to the muted echoes of their voices filtering up the marble staircase. It was intrusive, yes, but tolerable, and he convinced himself that this compromise might buy him years of uninterrupted peace. After all, granting them a little space seemed preferable to endless letters and complaints about hedge heights or driveway resurfacing. What Nathaniel could not have known was that this small concession, this seemingly innocuous gesture of cooperation, would become the hinge upon which the security of his entire world would turn. By the time he recognized the trap, the board had already begun reshaping his mansion into something more than a home, more than even an office. They were quietly laying the groundwork to transform it into a seat of power, a corporate symbol draped in the facade of community service, and he, the grieving widower who only wanted silence, had unknowingly invited them inside. The first time Nathaniel noticed something was wrong. It was not through an official letter or a knock at the door, but in the most mundane way possible. A confused delivery driver idling at his gate, squinting at a clipboard, asking if this was the correct address for the rental estate. Nathaniel dismissed it as a mistake, perhaps a neighboring property listed incorrectly, but the incident lingered in his thoughts long after the driver left. A week later, on his way back from the grocer's, he saw it. Bold black lettering staked into the ground just beyond the iron fence. For rent, luxury mansion. Inquire with HOA office. The sign was tilted slightly, the edges of the board still raw from where it had been sawed, suggesting it had been planted recently. Nathaniel stopped his car in the driveway and stared at the words as if they had no meaning, and for a moment he convinced himself it must be some prank by local teenagers. But the logo of the association at the bottom of the sign, printed neatly in blue ink, shattered any illusion of childish mischief. His mansion, the sanctuary that had stood as Eleanor's memory, was being marketed as a commodity by people who had no rightful claim to it. He tore the sign from the ground and carried it inside, leaning it against the marble wall of the foyer as though to confront it in silence. Later that evening, restless and unable to sit still, he searched the address online and his chest tightened when he found the listing. Bright photographs of his home, taken from angles he recognized immediately, paired with descriptions dripping, with adjectives like exclusive, historic, and ideal for high-profile tenants. There was no mention of him, no acknowledgement that the house was already occupied, as if he had been erased and the mansion was a vacant jewel awaiting a buyer's or renter's hand. His name appeared only once, buried in the legal text of the lease agreement downloadable from the site, and even there it was used in the context of authorizing the HOA to act on his behalf. His signature, or something resembling it, marked the bottom of the page. Nathaniel sat for hours studying the document, comparing it to the one he remembered signing weeks earlier. He recalled clearly the moment Veronica had pressed the pen into his hand, her eyes gleaming with that polite insistence masked as charm, the way she had flipped the pages quickly, drawing his attention to the section that specified use of the grand. How? But here the phrasing was different. It referred not to a single room, but to designated areas as determined by the board of the Homeowners Association, including but not limited to meeting spaces, offices, and accommodations necessary for administrative function. That single clause turned a temporary allowance into sweeping control, and his signature, slightly distorted, as if traced or reprinted from another source, sealed the illusion of legitimacy. He felt a heat rise in his chest, a betrayal so sharp it made his hands tremble. It was not just that they had lied, but that they had done so with such confidence, anticipating his grief, his solitude, his reluctance to fight. They had studied him, understood the cracks in his defenses, and slipped the knife precisely where it would hurt most. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt something other than quiet melancholy or dull routine. He felt rage, slow and simmering, the kind that thickened the air around him. Determined to confront the matter directly, he attended the next HOA meeting, though this time he did not allow them entry through the side door. He met them in the driveway, forcing them to stand in the afternoon sun, refusing the hospitality of his hall. Veronica, unshaken, simply smiled and explained that the signs were a matter of community interest, and that the listing was a proactive step to maximize resources. When Nathaniel demanded to know how they could dare to advertise his home, she produced a folder with neatly tabbed pages and recited phrases about temporary administrative jurisdiction and community benefit clauses. She assured him the arrangement was entirely legal and that he had, by his own consent, granted them access, beyond what he might personally recall. The board members, standing slightly behind her, nodded in unison, their faces composed but their eyes watchful. Nathaniel realized with a jolt that this was not a misunderstanding, not even a bold overreach that could be corrected with stern words. This was a deliberate act, carefully plotted, designed to strip him of ownership in everything but name. His protestations were deflected with the practiced indifference of people who had already accounted for his outrage, people who expected him to retreat into silence as he always had. That night, he walked the length of the mansion's corridors, pausing at each window where Eleanor had once drawn the curtains, each room where her presence still lingered. He felt the walls closing in, as though the house itself were shifting under the weight of the association's intrusion. For the first time since her death, the mansion did not feel like a refuge but a contested space, a battlefield disguised in velvet drapes and polished wood. He thought of the sign he had torn from the ground, still leaning against the wall of the foyer, its bold letters a declaration of war. He thought of the strangers who might already be calling the HOA, eager to rent a slice of his grief and memory, and he thought of Veronica, her smile unshaken even as he accused her of theft, a smile that told him she believed she had already won. As midnight drew near, Nathaniel sat alone in the library, the glow of the lamp pooling across the table, the fraudulent lease spread before him. His hand hovered over the paper, tracing the lines of his forged signature, the ink that pretended to be his consent. He whispered aloud, as though Eleanor might hear him still. "They've turned my house into a contract, Ellie. They've turned our life into a rental." And in that whisper was a vow, unspoken but undeniable. He would not let them claim it, not with their words, not with their papers, not with their signs staked like daggers into the ground. He had yielded once, and that mistake would not be repeated. Nathaniel did not need to wait long before the situation advanced from irritation into something far more invasive, something that pierced the fragile barrier he had tried to maintain between himself and the world beyond the gates. On a rainy Saturday morning, when the mist clung low over the garden and the sound of dripping water echoed against the stone terrace, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the mansion. At first, Nathaniel assumed it was a delivery, perhaps another courier confused by the online listing that still hadn't been removed despite his angry protests, but when the car door opened, a young couple emerged carrying luggage. They were dressed as though prepared for a weekend in the countryside, smiling with the confidence of people who believed they belonged. The man raised a hand in casual greeting, calling out to ask where they should park, while the woman glanced at the facade with a kind of awe reserved for tourists visiting historic landmarks. Nathaniel stood frozen on the steps, an umbrella in one hand, staring as they approached. When he demanded to know their business, they produced a neatly folded document stamped with the seal of the Homeowners Association, and signed once again with a version of his own name. They explained with rehearsed politeness that they had leased the east wing of the mansion for a month and had been assured by the association that the arrangement was already approved by the owner. The words hit him like cold rain against the skin, each syllable a reminder of the duplicity he had underestimated. He refused them entry, of course, but the damage had been done. They lingered at the gates for nearly an hour, making phone calls, visibly frustrated, until at last another vehicle arrived. A dark SUV from which Veronica herself stepped, accompanied by two board members dressed in businesslike attire despite the weather. She approached Nathaniel with that same polished smile, unfazed by the confrontation unfolding at the gate. She greeted the couple warmly, apologizing for the misunderstanding, before turning to Nathaniel with a look that blended patience and admonishment, as if he were a petulant child interfering with adult arrangements. She reminded him of the clause he had signed, again citing administrative use as determined by the board, and explained that these tenants were part of a community initiative to raise funds for neighborhood projects. Nathaniel felt the ground tilt beneath him as he listened. His words of protest came tumbling out in furious bursts, but she met them with calm replies, every phrase polished by legal consultation, every objection anticipated. She suggested, almost sweetly, that if he had concerns he could bring them before the next board session, which, she reminded him, was scheduled to be held inside his very own hall the following week. That evening, the mansion no longer felt like his at all. Nathaniel walked through its corridors and could not shake the image of strangers dragging suitcases across the floors Eleanor had once polished herself, or Veronica directing them to rooms filled with memories. It was more than invasion. It was erasure, the gradual rewriting of his place in his own story. He knew then that if he did not act decisively, the house would be taken piece by piece, not by force of arms, but by the suffocating embrace of bureaucracy disguised as community service. His solitude, once a shield, had become a vulnerability they exploited without hesitation. A few days later, determined to push back, he attended what the HOA called a special session, hosted, to his outrage, inside his library. When he entered, the long oak table where Eleanor had once held poetry readings was covered in folders and laptops, the board seated around it like executives in a corporate boardroom. They barely acknowledged him as he walked in, though Veronica gestured to a chair as though inviting him to sit in his own house. The meeting unfolded with chilling efficiency. They discussed financial projections, rental rates for different portions of the mansion, and even the possibility of repurposing the garden pavilion as a community event space. Each time Nathaniel interrupted, demanding they stop, his words were noted in the minutes as resident concerns. They had already reframed him, not as an owner, but as a tenant residing in a property that served broader communal needs. It was not simply audacity, it was strategy. At one point, when he insisted that the agreement had been forged, Veronica produced another document. This one thicker, bound in blue covers, labeled Interim Operational Lease. She slid it across the table toward him with a deliberate slowness, watching his face as he read. The clauses inside stretched to dozens of pages, each one more convoluted than the last. But buried within was language that suggested the board had authority not just over space usage, but over schedules, access, and even alterations to the property, as required for functional administration. It was an outright claim of dominion, dressed in bureaucratic jargon, and yet they acted as though it were nothing more than a routine contract. Nathaniel left the meeting shaken, but also awakened. The first signs of war had been written not on banners or in raised voices but on paper, insidious lines of text that sought to strip him of sovereignty. He realized that his instinct to ignore, to withdraw, had only given them more ground. Now they were not simply probing, they were advancing, confident that he lacked either the will or the knowledge to resist. The couple with the suitcases had been a test, a preview of what was to come, and the board meeting in his library had been their declaration that the mansion was no longer his fortress, but their prize. That night he stood by the great windows of the West Wing, staring out at the rain that lashed against the glass. In the reflection, he saw his own figure framed by the room Eleanor had adored, but he no longer recognized the man who had allowed strangers to step so easily across his threshold. He whispered to himself, not as a vow this time, but as a warning, "They've moved inside." And with that realization came the chilling certainty that the next step in their scheme would not be subtle, nor would it stop at leasing rooms. They intended to claim the mansion in full, and unless he fought them with every resource he had left, they would succeed. Nathaniel had always believed that architecture carried its own form of truth, that a building told a story which could not be erased no matter how many coats of paint or layers of bureaucracy were applied to it. Yet as he walked through his mansion, in the weeks following the confrontation with the HOA board, he felt as though the story of his house was being rewritten in real time, and he was powerless to stop it. Rooms that once seemed sacred began to feel tainted. The long gallery where Eleanor had hung portraits of her family now held folding chairs from the association stacked in rows, as if they had claimed the walls as their own. The study, lined with books marked by Eleanor's notes in the margins, had been invaded by filing cabinets filled with HOA records, their utilitarian ugliness clashing with the delicate woodwork. Nathaniel tried to push them out, tried to reclaim his space, but every attempt was met with a calm reminder that his operational lease authorized such adjustments, that he had, on paper, already yielded the right to dictate how his property was used. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating intrusion, he began to sift through the piles of papers that had accumulated in the library, HOA documents left behind after one of their interminable sessions. He read through bylaws, meeting notes, and correspondence until his eyes blurred, and then, quite suddenly, he stumbled across something that made his breath catch. It was a memorandum dated several months before he had even been approached by Veronica, a record of an HOA board meeting in which his mansion was already listed as the proposed permanent administrative residence. The language was chilling in its certainty, as though his consent were a mere formality that would inevitably be obtained. They had planned this long before he ever signed anything, had perhaps even rehearsed the words Veronica would use to soften his resistance, had already penciled his home into their maps as though ownership were nothing but an obstacle to be tidily erased. The discovery both enraged and steadied him. For the first time, he felt that he was not simply a victim of his own naivety, but a target of a calculated strategy. He understood now why Veronica had been so patient, why her smile had never faltered even as he ripped their signs from the ground. This was not improvisation, but execution, a campaign that moved with the inevitability of a chess game where the opening moves had been plotted far in advance. He sat there in the lamplight, surrounded by the whispers of his wife's annotated books and the sterile odor of photocopied paper, and realized that the mansion itself had become a kind of contested narrative, its walls telling two stories at once, one of love and memory, the other of appropriation and control. Determined to fight back, Nathaniel contacted a local attorney, a woman named Rachel Whitmore, recommended by an acquaintance from his past. She was young, sharp, and unapologetically direct, and when she came to the mansion she walked through its rooms with a critical eye, absorbing the surreal spectacle of an HOA boardroom transplanted into a private home. Nathaniel poured out his account, showing her the fraudulent lease, the forged signature, the memorandum he had unearthed, and she listened with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "They're not just stretching the law," she told him after hours of review. "They're trying to create a new reality on paper, one in which you're already irrelevant. If this stands, they can make the case that your mansion is no longer your residence but a community facility." Her words chilled him more than he expected, because they confirmed the fear that had been gnawing at him since that night in the library. Together, they began to dig deeper, tracing the trail of documents back through county records and municipal filings. What they discovered was even more unsettling. The HOA had already submitted paperwork to register the mansion's address as their official headquarters, and in one database it was already listed as such. The county clerk had accepted the filing without question, relying on the authority of the association's seal and the attached lease agreement bearing Nathaniel's forged consent. On paper, at least in the eyes of the local government, his mansion was not his sanctuary but the corporate seat of the homeowners association. Nathaniel felt the walls of his reality tilt again. Yet Rachel was not deterred. She reminded him that paper could lie, but evidence could expose the lie. They cataloged everything, photographing the rooms as they had been repurposed, making copies of every memorandum and filing, marking each inconsistency. It was exhausting, and at times Nathaniel felt a bitter irony in being forced to document his own home as though he were an intruder trying to prove his presence. Still, he pressed on, driven by something more than anger now, something closer to defiance. He could hear Eleanor's voice in memory, teasing him for his stubbornness, telling him that once he set his mind to a project, he never let it go. This was not a project of stone and steel, but of survival, and it demanded the same unyielding discipline. Then came the moment that transformed his unease into outright alarm. He returned late one afternoon from a meeting with Rachel to find the front gates open and unfamiliar voices echoing from inside the house. He stepped through the foyer and froze. A family he had never seen before was wandering the main hall, their children running across the marble floor, while a man in a suit spoke with one of the board members as though finalizing a tour. Nathaniel demanded to know what was happening, and Veronica herself emerged from the dining room, explaining smoothly that these were potential, long-term tenants being shown the property as part of the HOA's expansion plan. Nathaniel's outrage boiled over. He shouted, he threatened, but Veronica only raised her brows, her calm demeanor unshaken, and reminded him once more that the lease authorized necessary use as determined by the board when the family left. Bewildered but intrigued by the mansion's grandeur, Nathaniel confronted Veronica in the hall. For the first time, her mask slipped just slightly, and she said in a tone that was both cold and deliberate, "You should stop fighting this. You had a chance to be remembered as the man who gifted his home to the community. If you keep resisting, you'll be remembered as the man who lost it." The words cut deeper than any legal clause because they revealed what she truly wanted. Not compromise, not even money, but the transformation of his identity from owner to relic. That night, Nathaniel did not sleep. He walked the corridors until dawn, tracing the outlines of furniture, brushing his hands across the banisters Eleanor had once leaned upon, whispering promises into the empty air. The discovery of the memorandum, the fraudulent filings, the invasion of strangers, it all converged into a moment of clarity. He could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding to be corrected with logic or appeals to decency. It was a battle for the soul of his house, and by extension, the soul of his memory with Eleanor. The HOA had already built their fortress of paper, but Nathaniel had something they underestimated: the will to fight not as a resident submitting complaints, but as a man defending the last remnant of his life's meaning. And as the first light of morning spilled through the stained glass windows, painting the marble floor with fractured colors, Nathaniel swore that he would turn their own arrogance against them, that the very walls they had tried to appropriate would bear witness to their undoing. The weeks that followed blurred together into a rhythm of confrontation, paperwork, and quiet dread that pressed in on Nathaniel like a slow suffocation. For every day seemed to bring a new reminder that the Homeowners Association was no longer nibbling at the edges of his life, but striking openly at its center. The most immediate blow came in the form of an official notice taped to his gate, a document written in the same polished legal tone that Veronica always used in conversation, declaring that the HOA had filed a complaint against him for obstructing community operations within the premises and warning of potential fines and legal actions if he continued to interfere. To read such a notice pinned brazenly to the property his wife had once treated as sacred ground filled Nathaniel with a rage that seemed almost physical, a pulse of heat that made his hands shake, yet he also knew that anger alone was a tool they expected, something they could point to as evidence of his irrationality. He needed control, and more importantly, he needed proof. Rachel, ever more determined as the case deepened, urged him to hold steady and to think of the battle as one of attrition. She explained that the HOA's tactic was not merely to occupy his home, but to exhaust him until resistance felt impossible, to bury him under the weight of their documents, their meetings, their fabricated authority until he lost the will to contest them. She insisted they continue gathering evidence, and together they scrutinized every line of every altered contract, cross-referencing dates, comparing signatures, and compiling a record of inconsistency so extensive it filled several binders. Nathaniel began to feel his life shifting into a strange performance where he was both the actor and the stage, his every action documented, his every word cataloged, as though he no longer lived in a home but inside a case file. Then came the incident that marked, for him, the moment he realized the HOA would stop at nothing. One evening, as he returned from Rachel's office, he found the water to the mansion abruptly shut off. At first he assumed it was a municipal issue, but when he called the utility company, they explained with rehearsed politeness that the HOA had submitted a request on his behalf to suspend service during property renovations. Nathaniel stood in his kitchen, staring at the dry taps, listening to the echo of silence where water should have been, and understood that this was not an accident. They were probing his tolerance, stripping away the comforts of daily life to remind him that in their eyes he was no longer a master of the house, but an inconvenient guest. It did not end there. Within days, an inspector arrived unannounced at the gates, claiming he had been informed of multiple code violations: unsafe electrical wiring, hazardous storage in the basement, and improper maintenance of external structures. Nathaniel escorted the man through the house, seething inwardly as the inspector took notes, only to discover later that the complaints had originated from the HOA itself. It was not enough that they occupied his halls. They now sought to brand him negligent in caring for the very space that had defined his life. When Rachel saw the inspection report, she shook her head and muttered that such tactics were classic forms of pressure, ways to force an owner into capitulation by layering accusations until the truth no longer mattered. The worst moment, however, came one evening when Nathaniel returned from a solitary walk through the garden to find a locked door in his own house. The library, his sanctuary, had been sealed with a padlock, and a notice had been taped across it declaring the room restricted for administrative use. He tore the notice down and smashed the lock in fury, but inside he found the shelves disturbed, folders of HOA paperwork stacked in place of Eleanor's books, and the lingering scent of strangers who had treated the room as theirs. It was not just the theft of space, but the theft of memory, the rewriting of his wife's presence into nothing more than a storage closet for bureaucrats. That night he sat alone at her old desk, head bowed in his hands, and wondered whether he had the strength to continue fighting an enemy that wielded law and deception rather than swords. But the next morning brought clarity. Rachel informed him that she had uncovered internal correspondence suggesting that the HOA's actions were not merely opportunistic, but part of a coordinated scheme with a property management company formed by Veronica and 2 other board members. They were using his mansion as a flagship example to attract wealthy renters under the guise of community housing initiatives, lining their pockets while cloaking their theft in legality. This revelation hardened Nathaniel's resolve. It was no longer just about saving his home. It was about exposing the corruption that had entangled his neighborhood, about refusing to let Eleanor's memory be leveraged as a business model. Nathaniel began to move with new purpose. He documented the water shutoff, the fraudulent inspection, the padlocked library, and the falsified rental agreements, building a case that showed not isolated incidents but a pattern of harassment designed to strip him of ownership. He stopped confronting Veronica in person, realizing that every angry outburst played into her narrative of him as unstable, and instead he saved his words for Rachel in the careful construction of their argument. He attended no more HOA sessions, leaving them to speak to empty chairs, their minutes reflecting only their own voices. And, in that silence, he found strength. He realized that while they had paper and seals, he had history and truth, and when the time came, those would matter. By the end of that month, Nathaniel felt the mansion settle around him like an old ally preparing for war. The walls no longer seemed violated, but waiting, patient, as if the house itself understood that its story was not yet surrendered. He would not yield, not to notices, not to padlocks, not to the cold smiles of Veronica Clay. The escalation had reached its peak, and as he sat in the west wing, under the fractured colors of the stained glass windows, he whispered to Eleanor that he would carry the fight forward, that the house would not fall quietly into the hands of thieves disguised as neighbors. The trial arrived with the oppressive inevitability of a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for months, and Nathaniel walked into the courthouse with the weight of his entire life pressing against his shoulders, every step echoing like the sound of a gavel waiting to fall. The grand chamber, with its high ceilings and cold marble walls, seemed almost a parody of his own mansion, and he felt as though he were stepping from one contested stage into another. Only this time the performance would be public and irreversible. Veronica sat at the opposite table, immaculate in her beige suit, her expression a calm mask polished by countless community meetings, and beside her were the other board members, their faces carefully neutral, though their eyes betrayed the same confidence they had carried into his library weeks before. They believed the case was already won, that their papers and their seals, their signatures and their bureaucratic phrasing would crush the resistance of one grieving widower who had no allies beyond a single determined lawyer. Rachel rose to speak, her voice steady but edged with the kind of conviction that comes not from rehearsed rhetoric but from righteous anger, and she began to unravel the story with deliberate patience, threading together each incident not as isolated complaints but as a chain of calculated acts. She presented the forged lease, laying it beside the genuine draft Nathaniel had signed, highlighting the subtle alterations that transformed permission to use a hall into authority over an entire mansion. She showed the memorandum Nathaniel had discovered, proof that the HOA had plotted the seizure of his home before he had ever been approached, and then moved to the county filings that falsely listed his address as the association's headquarters. The judge leaned forward as she spoke, his frown deepening with each revelation, while Veronica shifted slightly in her chair, the first crack in her composure since the battle began. But Rachel did not stop there. She unveiled the correspondence linking Veronica and two board members to a private property management company, a venture that promised lucrative returns by renting high-value estates under the guise of community housing. She placed before the court advertisements that had circulated online, showcasing Nathaniel's home as a rentable estate, photographs stolen from his private spaces, and she let the silence stretch as the judge studied them, the implication hanging heavy in the air. This was not governance, it was profiteering, and it was executed with the arrogance of people who believed their authority made them untouchable. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten as each piece of evidence was revealed, for it was as though the months of suffocation were being released into the open, his suffering given voice and shape, no longer dismissed as the paranoia of an old man, but recognized as truth. When it was Veronica's turn to speak, her tone remained honeyed, her words careful, but the certainty was gone. She tried to paint Nathaniel as confused, as a widower overwhelmed by grief, a man who misinterpreted agreements and reacted with hostility when approached with opportunities to contribute to the community. She held up the lease and claimed the language was clear, that his signature, however strange it appeared, was binding, that the association had acted with nothing but the neighborhood's interest in mind. Yet, as she spoke, the contrast between Rachel's meticulous evidence and her own vague appeals to procedure grew starker, and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The turning point came when Rachel presented the photographs Nathaniel had taken of his library, locked and repurposed as a storage space for HOA archives. She reminded the court that this was not just any room but the private workspace of an architect whose original drawings and intellectual property were housed there, materials never intended for public consumption. By transforming that space into their archive, the HOA had not only trespassed physically but violated federal protections of intellectual property, an overreach that extended far beyond neighborhood governance. The judge's expression hardened at that, and Nathaniel felt the first true flicker of hope ignite in his chest. The climax unfolded with a swiftness that startled even him. The judge declared the operational lease void, citing fraud, misrepresentation, and abuse of authority. He ordered the immediate removal of the HOA from the premises and referred the matter for further investigation regarding the property management scheme. For the first time in months, Nathaniel felt the invisible chains loosen, the suffocating weight lift, as though the house itself had exhaled in relief. Veronica's face, still frozen in that professional calm, betrayed only the faintest tremor around her mouth, but it was enough to tell Nathaniel that the illusion of her control had shattered. As the gavel struck, sealing the decision, Nathaniel closed his eyes and thought of Eleanor, of the promise he had whispered to her in the lonely hours of night, and he felt that he had finally kept it. His mansion was his again, not just in name, but in truth, reclaimed from the web of paper and deceit that had nearly devoured it. Yet he also knew this was not the end, but the moment before another kind of beginning. For the judge's referral meant that the rot within the HOA would be dragged into light, and others who had suffered quieter indignities might at last see justice. Nathaniel stood, weary but unbroken, and walked out of the courthouse into the pale afternoon sun, feeling for the first time in years not like a man bound to memories, but like a man who had wrested his life back from the jaws of those who thought they could own it. The weeks after the verdict unfolded with a strange quiet that felt almost unfamiliar to Nathaniel, as though the house itself were settling back into its natural rhythm, shaking off the intrusion like a patient creature recovering from a long illness. The padlocks were gone, the signs torn down, and the echoes of strangers' voices no longer lingered in the halls. For the first time in months, Nathaniel could walk through his mansion without the uneasy sense that someone else was laying claim to his memories. He moved slowly from room to room, touching the banisters, the windowsills, the shelves that had been crowded with foreign folders, reclaiming each space with the simple weight of his presence. The library in particular felt transformed, not because the harm had been erased, but because it now bore the deeper resonance of survival. Eleanor's books were back in their rightful order, his drawings once again spread across her desk, and when he sat there in the evening light he felt that the room had not been diminished by its violation, but strengthened, as though it had absorbed the struggle into its story. Neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion or indifference now approached with tentative respect, some even with apologies. A few admitted quietly that they had suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to challenge Veronica's authority, and Nathaniel accepted their words with a reserved nod, neither bitter nor fully forgiving. He understood now that his battle had not only been about stone and paper, but about the way fear and convenience could silence an entire community, and he resolved that the silence would not return. When Rachel suggested that he consider running for a position on the restructured HOA board, he hesitated, instinctively recoiling from the idea of entangling himself in the very machinery that had nearly destroyed him. Yet he also recognized the truth in her argument. If people like Veronica had thrived because others looked away, then perhaps the only safeguard was vigilance from those who knew how fragile a home could be when treated as a commodity. Still, he did not rush into politics. Instead, Nathaniel opened the mansion once a month to host lectures, exhibitions, and gatherings that celebrated history, architecture, and art, turning the house not into an administrative office as the HOA had once envisioned, but into a living space of memory and community that carried Eleanor's spirit forward. Each event brought life back into the rooms without stripping them of their soul, and as guests lingered in the hall where Veronica had once presided over her sham sessions, Nathaniel felt a quiet vindication. His house was no longer a contested prize, but a beacon, its story reclaimed and reshaped on his own terms. And when he walked the garden at dusk, the oak tree casting long shadows across the grass, he whispered again the promise he had made during the darkest nights. The house was safe, the memory preserved, and he had kept faith with the life that had been his and Eleanor's alone,